Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a Diablo 3 patch 2.6.9 season 21 guide on the best barbarian build, the Whirlrend. This guide should also work for future seasons unless there's a massive change in the build, but always check for updates in the video description. I'll have there the most up-to-date info, a link to the D3 planner on the best gear and skills. And that's what we're going to go over in this video. The gear, the skills, and the playstyle that you will want to rock this build. So let's start with a gear overview. The Whirlrend Barbarian is all about whirlwind and rend. So we're going to need the Wrath of the Waste set. The 2-piece bonus increases the damage and duration of rend. This is our main damage dealing skill for this build. Whirlwind will just be a vehicle. The 4-piece bonus, during Whirlwind and for 3 seconds thereafter, you gain 50% damage reduction and your applied rends deal triple damage. This is a huge source of toughness for us, and it's a very important addition, a change they made over the seasons to let this damage reduction last for 3 seconds after Whirlwind stops. This allows us to stop and rend when we want to, without losing our buffs. In general though, we will want to be constantly whirlwinding. We never want to stop for more than 3 seconds, and we shouldn't have any reason to. And then the 6-piece, Whirlwind gains the effect of the Dust Devil's rune, and all whirlwind and rend damage is increased by 10,000%. While this used to be a whirlwind based build with respect to damage, rend is so much more damage that whirlwind's damage becomes inconsequential. Everything revolves around buffing rend's damage, which absolutely eclipses the damage of the whirlwind skill. Now we're going to work some supporting items into this build. A supporting weapon set, Little Rogue and Slanderer. Every time you spend primary resource, gain 6% increased attack speed, damage, and armor for 5 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. This is a huge offensive buff and a little bit of a defensive buff. Now you might ask, what about the Bulkathos weapons? Those increase your fury generation, and they give you 45% increased attack speed and move speed during Whirlwind. Yes, that's a great buff, and for speed runs, you can go with that. But your absolute highest DPS option is going to be Little Rogue and Slanderer. Then in our cube, we're going to want the mighty weapon Ambo's Pride. Attacking with Whirlwind also applies rend, and the total damage of rend is dealt over 1 second. So all that damage that it would apply over many seconds is now condensed down into 1 second. Huge buff to our rend damage, and lets us just whirlwind around, automatically applying rends. Now we will still want to manually cast rends at certain points, but we'll talk more about that a little later on. So Ambo's Pride in the cube. Another cube item we're going to want here is Lamentation. Rend can now stack up to 2 times on an enemy, and the damage of rend is increased. Very important damage multiplier there. We're also getting in our cube a Ring of Royal Grandeur. You get these from doing Act 1 bounties. You cannot gamble for this item. You cannot upgrade rings to get this item. Act 1 bounties. Open up that bounty bag. The ring will hopefully be inside. It has a chance to be. And the reason we want this is because we want to work in the Captain Crimson set. The belt, and either the pants or the boots. This gives us life regen, but more importantly, it gives us 20% cooldown, 20% resource cost reduction, and the 3-piece, damage dealt is increased by your percent of cooldown reduction. We're going to be stacking a lot of that, and damage taken is reduced by your percentage of resource cost reduction. Now this is the highest DPS variant of this build. You don't have to work in Captain Crimson's. If you don't, then you would wear the Lamentation belt. You would not have to wear a Ring of Royal Grandeur, and instead you would get a Band of Might ring for more damage reduction. That's a variant of the build that survives better, but again, deals less damage. For our bracers, we're gonna get Mortix Brace. Wrath of the Berserker gains the effect of every rune, and we're going to try to maintain 100% uptime on Wrath of the Berserker. How are we going to do that? With the help of an Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac. Reduce the remaining cooldown on one of your skills by 1 second when you hit with a resource spending attack like Whirlwind. Constant whirlwinding through enemies, constant triggering the Orots. For extra damage, we're going to work in a convention of elements. This gives us a window of time during which we're doing a lot more damage. You ideally want to ensure that when you rotate into your damage window, you are actively attacking enemies and not retreating. But because there aren't a lot of other things to time with this build, getting that window down isn't as important as with certain other builds. I know a lot of people gripe about convention rotations, gripe about builds that rely around that little window, so for the most part, it could just be a set it and forget it thing. Sometimes you're dealing more damage. Lastly, we're going to want to work in a flavor of time. Pylon effects last twice as long. Excellent during Greater Rifting. That said, if you don't have a good flavor of time, you could go with a Hellfire Amulet. The Barbarian has a lot of really good passive abilities, so if you have a really good Hellfire and a really bad flavor of time, then you could go with that Hellfire. For our legendary gems, we're going to want a Bane of the Trapped. More damage against crowd control impaired enemies. At level 25, it unlocks an aura that automatically makes all enemies around you crowd controlled. So this gem basically activates itself. We're going to want a Taeguk, more damage and more toughness when we are channeling. And we're channeling because it's Whirlwind. Then lastly, a Bane of the Stricken. This is when pushing the highest Greater Rifts. This build suffers quite a bit versus single targets. So those Rift Guardians are going to be difficult to take down. Bane of the Stricken is the gem for dealing with high GR Rift Guardians. When it's taking you way too long to kill the Rift Guardian, this is where this gem kicks in. Before that, a Bane of the Powerful is a better option. If you are maintaining your Bane of the Powerful buff all the time, it is the better option. Most people swap to a Bane of the Stricken way too soon. Bane of the Powerful gives you a static, constant buff. Bane of the Stricken needs to build up that damage bonus, those Stricken stacks. But it's not enough to just reach parity with the Bane of the Powerful buff, it also then has to play catch up for all the time it's spent dealing less damage. So for fast content, Bane of the Powerful. For pushing the highest GRs, Bane of the Stricken. As for the other gems we want, in our weapons, emeralds, more crit damage. In our chest and pants, we're gonna want diamonds for more all resist. If you feel you don't need the toughness, you can go with rubies for more damage, but you'll probably need it. In the helm, non-negotiable, diamond for more cooldown reduction. We want to soak up a ton of cooldown with this build. Now we're going to go over exactly what we want on every piece of gear in a little bit. First, we're going to take a look at the skills. First, we're going to take Rend, Bloodbath. Again, Rend is our damage dealer here. Rend is a huge AoE power that causes enemies to bleed over a period of time. And with Bloodbath, enemies killed while bleeding cause all enemies within 10 yards to begin bleeding for a bunch of damage as physical. Basically, it makes the Rend spread as enemies die. All enemies are going to fall under the category of enemies killed while bleeding. And this is what makes this build so good at dealing with huge crowds of enemies as opposed to single targets. A huge part of the playstyle with this build is building density of enemies on screen. We're going to have a number of tools at our disposal to help do that, but part of it is the playstyle of figuring out how to kite enemies. A lot of this build revolves around your strategy. You don't want to just stop and kill a couple straggling monsters. You want to ideally move on to another big pack, try to get those guys to follow you and pull them along with you. Now onto our vehicle, Whirlwind Wind Shear. Again, not a damage source. This is our vehicle for damage, our vehicle for the entire build. We can't run this build without Whirlwind, and Wind Shear makes us gain Fury for every enemy struck. If you're running the Bolcathos variant, you don't need Wind Shear. You can go with Blood Funnel instead for more sustain, crits heal you, but with Little Rogue and Slanderer, Wind Shear is non-negotiable. You need to generate Fury, and people are going to ask, hey, there's no other Fury generator. How are we supposed to generate Fury at the very start? Yeah, you're gonna have to take a little bit of damage. This build is a little ballsy. When you first start off a Greater Rift, we're gonna have no tool here to generate Fury. But Barbarians gain Fury when they take damage, so you're gonna want to actually move into the fray and take just the tiniest sliver of damage, and that little amount of momentum should be enough to get your Whirlwind going, and then Wind Shear is going to build up your rage and you're not going to have rage problems anymore. Now, if you have a fast computer with an SSD, what you could do before diving into a Greater Rift is actually go into another zone, build up your Fury to max, and then get back to town, quickly open the Greater Rift, and hop in while you still have Fury. This would prevent you from having to take damage to actually start building the Fury in a dangerous Greater Rift when you can do it in a more safe environment. Next, we're going to want Wrath of the Berserker. For a limited time, this gives us more crit chance, attack speed, a dodge chance, and more move speed. Amazing buff for barbarians, and we're going to seek to have 100% uptime on it. Thanks to our bracers, we'll have all runes. If you don't have the bracers, definitely get Insanity, 50% more damage. Otherwise, Ariat's Wail, not helping us here. Slaughter, also not really helping. The damage basically here is inconsequential. But Striding Giant, another 50% damage reduction. Very powerful, and Thrive on Chaos gives us a little bit of sustain in the form of life per Fury spent. We're constantly spending Fury, so this basically translates into life per second. Next, we're going to want to take Ignore Pain, Iron Hide. This gives us another 50% damage reduction and immunity to crowd control impairing effects for 7 seconds. If you can maintain 100% uptime on this via your cooldown and Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, awesome. You might not be able to, in which case you're going to pop it when you're expecting those damage spikes. You're going to pop it when you're getting crowd controlled and you need to escape. If you're not going with a Captain Crimson build, then instead of Ignore Pain, you can go with Ground Stomp, Wrenching Smash. Ground Stomp will generate Fury for you, so you don't have to worry about how to start off with Fury at the start of a rift. And Wrenching Smash will help group enemies. It's going to pull them in, and Ground Stomp will also trigger your Band of Might. So basically, Band of Might gives you a huge amount of damage reduction, so it'd be sacrificing Ignore Pain, but gaining the damage reduction from the Band of Might instead. Next, we're going to take Battle Rage, Swords to Plowshares. We want to always have Battle Rage activated. The base effect gives us 10% more damage and increases our crit chance by 3%. Swords to Plowshares, crits heal you and your pets for up to a bunch of life. So this is a great source of sustain. Typically we would take Bloodshed, deal damage equal to 20% of your recent critical hits to enemies within 20 yards every 1 second. However, bleed effects don't crit. So our rend isn't actually critting. Its damage is improved by having critical hit chance, but it's not actually dealing crit damage. So it does benefit from crit chance and crit damage, but that damage is just factored in. It's averaged out into the bleed damage. So it simulates having crit chance. It does technically crit, but it's not dealing those damage spikes of crit damage, and therefore Bloodshed is not helping here. If you feel you don't need the sustain, you can go with Ferocity. Let's say you're doing speed content, go even faster. Then lastly, we're going to take Ancient Spear, Rage Flip. This is one of those tools that we're going to use to pull enemies in. We're building density. We're going to be trying to maneuver enemies. Figuring out how to properly use your Ancient Spear is a skill you're going to practice, build up, get better at. Damage is inconsequential. You're throwing out a spear. You are Scorpion from Mortal Kombat, flipping enemies back toward you to try to position them all together in order to deal your mass area damage to them. Now, the enemy doesn't get brought right in front of you. It gets flipped behind you. So again, there's going to be some finesse here. You're going to learn how to get a feel for your Ancient Spear. As you are whirlwinding in a group of enemies, you're going to be shooting out your spear to bring in stragglers. You got those ranged enemies that are backing away from you, bring them in. You got those annoying monsters that run away from you after attacking, bring them in. You want to try to bring some stragglers along with you as you move on to the next big group of enemies. Drag them along with you with Ancient Spear. Now, if you're doing speed content, you probably don't need Ancient Spear. Again, instead, you can go with Ground Stomp, Wrenching Smash. If you want, you can even go with War Cry to generate Fury and give you some extra defense, some extra toughness, either Impunity for all resist or Veteran's Warning for dodge chance. But then taking a look at the passives, we're going to want Brawler. As long as there are 3 enemies within 12 yards, all of your damage is increased by 20%. There should always be 3 enemies within 12 yards. Otherwise, you should be flipping them into your death funnel. We're going to want Ruthless. You deal 40% more damage to enemies below 30% health. This helps us finish off stragglers. This helps us finish off the Rift Guardian. When there aren't many enemies left alive, because they're all dying, but other enemies are low on health, this is going to be our finisher. Rampage is just a Barbarian staple. After you kill an enemy, you gain a strength buff That translates into more damage and a bit more toughness. Then Berserker Rage will often find ourselves near max fury thanks to Wind Shear, thanks to constantly whirlwinding through enemies. This gives us 20% additional damage. But again, the Barbarian has a number of excellent passives. So if you have a Hellfire Amulet or you want to make some substitutions, you can get Nerves of Steel if you want that extra life. If you're playing hardcore, you're definitely taking Nerves of Steel. If you're having trouble maintaining perma uptime on Wrath of the Berserker, get Boon of Bolcathos. You need to have a 100% uptime. So if you don't yet have enough cooldown, or you're not going with the Captain Crimson version of this build, Boon of Bolcathos reduces the cooldown on Wrath of the Berserker by 30 seconds. Now, as for what we want on every piece of gear, on our shoulders, we're going to want cooldown reduction, rend damage, area damage, and then either strength or all resist. Now, a note about area damage. The rend that is applied automatically via your whirlwind will not apply area damage. It's not possible for it to trigger area damage. However, if you're not doing speed content, then you will be applying manual rends every so often in order to trigger this area damage. So to maximize the amount of damage you want to do, you want to have area damage on your gear, and you want to be manually applying rends in order to benefit from that extra area damage. For our Helm, Strength, Vitality, Crit Chance. Amulet, Physical Damage, Crit Chance, Crit Damage, Cooldown if it's a Flavor of Time. If it's a Hellfire, forget the cooldown. For our Gloves, Crit Chance, Crit Damage, Cooldown, Area Damage. If you have to sacrifice something for Strength, sacrifice the area damage. For our Chest, Strength, Vitality, Rend Damage. Bracers, Physical Damage, Strength, Vitality, Crit Chance. For our Belt, Strength, Vitality, All Resist, and Life. For our Pants, Strength, Vitality, All Resist. For our Boots, Strength, Vitality, All Resist, and then either Life or Armor. For our Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, Attack Speed, Crit Chance, Cooldown. For our Convention of Elements, Crit Damage, Crit Chance, then you can go with either Raw Damage or you can go with Cooldown. If you want to follow the exact setup we have here, you'll be able to have 100% uptime on Wrath of the Berserker, and you would not need to get cooldown on the ring, so you can get, again, raw damage or strength or even area damage instead. On our weapons, we want area damage on both of them, cooldown on one of them, percent damage on both of them, and then if you have an extra stat, you can go with strength. With this exact setup, we'll be stacking 59% cooldown reduction, and that should be enough for perma Wrath of the Berserker combined with the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac. As for your Paragon points, get your total move speed up to 25%, factoring in whatever may be on gear, then dump into strength. If you're having survivability issues, you can allocate some into vitality instead. You will not need max fury. For offense, cooldown first, then crit chance, then crit damage, and then attack speed. Normally you want to balance your crit chance and crit damage, but this build has things trigger on crit, so triggering crits more often is beneficial to us. For defense, we're going to go all resist, life, armor, life regen. And for utility, we'll go life on hit, area damage, resource cost reduction, and gold find. And that's going to wrap up this guide. As always, check the video description for the most up-to-date information, D3 planner link with the best items, the best skills, any potential changes in the future. And otherwise, be sure to check out my leveling guide on how to quickly level from 1 to 70 at the start of a new season, and my video on the best builds of the season. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you like what you see on this channel and want to support the creation of more content, you can consider pledging on YouTube or Patreon and unlocking behind-the-scenes content, monthly virtual hangouts, and more. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykkers Raiders for more Diablo content.